The Trump administration is finalizing their plan to combat the opioid epidemic, and it turns out that there's a little bit of infighting between the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services. Now, they're coming at it from two different approaches, which is why the legislation that's being proposed by the Trump administration has some relatively good components, but some pretty bad proposals as well. Now, to be sure, the legislation is not finalized, nothing has been released yet. However, Politico did get its hands on a version of the legislation, and here's what we know so far. First, I always want to talk about the severity of this epidemic because the numbers are mind-boggling. So there were more than 64,000 drug overdose deaths in 2016. Emergency rooms recorded a 30% spike in opioid overdoses last summer, indicating that the devastating crisis is actually worsening. It is not getting better. So there is a lot of urgency when it comes to dealing with this. And remember, Trump said that he would deal with it immediately after coming to office, and that is not what he has done. Now, here's what he is potentially going to propose. Trump is finalizing a plan that calls for law enforcement measures like the death penalty for some drug dealers that public health advocates and congressional Republicans warn will detract from efforts to reverse the epidemic. So the law enforcement component of the proposal obviously comes from the Department of Justice. They want to really beef up the war on drugs, and their idea is punitive measures. Punitive measures, that's the way to go, even though we've had decades of failed policy involving the war on drugs. Now, it does also include prevention and treatment measures, and those are the components that come from Health and Human Services. So that's where you see a little bit of a divide when it comes to the Trump administration.
Yeah, so actually there are good parts of this bill. In fact, there's parts that are so good in treating people with opioid addictions that they think it's totally unrealistic that Congress will pass a bill that large. Because conservatives will want to kill it. They'll say, no, it's deficit spending, which they didn't mind when they were passing the trillions of dollars in tax cuts for the rich. But anyway, in this case, they say it's unlikely to pass. And the amount of money that Trump himself has allocated is wildly unrealistic, given the scope, not just the scope of the problem, but the scope of the proposed solutions, the positive ones coming from the health community, okay? And then, of course, I'm amused by the Justice Department guys like, no, you know what we'll do? We'll break them. Yeah, that'll show them. No, they're already broken. They're addicted. We're trying to help them.
Right.
But when all you have is a hammer, everything seems like nails. Like, no, you don't have to hammer these guys. They're in trouble. You need to help them.
Well, remember, the reason why the war on drugs continues till this day, and the reason why there's still a federal prohibition on relatively harmless drugs like marijuana is because people have made careers off of the prohibition of it. So those are the very people that are employed by the Department of Justice, which is why they want to come at it from a more draconian and punitive perspective. Now, let's give you some more details on this. The Trump administration proposes to change how the government pays for opioid prescriptions to limit access to powerful painkillers. It also calls on Congress to change how Medicaid pays for treatment, seeking to make it easier for patients with addictions to get inpatient care. It would also create a new Justice Department task force that more aggressively monitors internet sales. Now remember, we've talked about that task force before, and Kellyanne Conway is likely to be the head of that task force, even though she has no experience with it. But nonetheless, there are the good components that would help those with addiction. They would take some preventative measures, and also they would expand access to naloxone, which is the drug that first responders can give to someone as they're overdosing on prescription painkillers or heroin.
So that should, of course, be readily available to all the first responders. So it's about time they did that. That's great. And I want to actually even compliment one part from the Justice Department proposal. They'd be empowered to step up prosecutions of criminally negligent doctors, pharmacies, and other providers. But let's note that there is one really important part of that is missing. In fact, the most important part. Prosecutors would not be encouraged or empowered to go after the biggest drug dealers, which are the pharmaceutical companies and their distributors. They're the ones selling the drugs to the pill mills in the first place. They're the ones that know that a tidal wave of opioids went into West Virginia like that all the people in West Virginia couldn't possibly take in over a decade. They know exactly where their drugs are going. They're literally the drug dealers, but they're the only ones who aren't going to be touched at all.
Right, I think it's interesting that they don't want to approach the root of the problem and they want to go after the pharmacists and the doctors. And look, there are definitely bad actors, who are pharmacists and doctors, but that's not the root of the problem. And there was a lot of tough talk by Trump during the election in regard to these pharmaceutical companies, and he has done nothing to rein them in.
So, and actually leads to two other things, right? So, first of all, 64,000 drug deaths is, we talked about and continue to talk about because it's amazing. It's brought down the life expectancy of the average American by itself. That's how many deaths there are related to opioids. So we're losing years of our lives because of this abuse on average, okay? So Trump said he was gonna stop opioid abuse, period. So under this proposal, if it works perfectly, they say that it'll eventually get rid of a third of the problem. What happened? I thought he was gonna fix it overnight.
Period.
Yeah, look, what a preposterous set of lies that he told during the campaign and that people believed. So now, but he's had a year, he's had over a year to do something about it. Why is the proposal coming all like 14 months later? But okay, fine. So what happened in that year? Because Trump's magically gonna solve everything, right? Well, it turns out that the CDC reported just last week that the emergency rooms recorded a 30% spike in opioid overdoses last summer. So it got 30% worse under Trump. Because he sat on his hands and didn't do anything for over a year. Now he does this proposal. Some parts are good, some parts are clearly deficient, some parts are preposterous. So now let's get to executing the drug dealers. So even deeply Republican senators like Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia say, no, that doesn't make any sense. She said, I don't see that's going to solve the problem. Right. And West Virginia's hit the hardest, and he won that state by I think 49 points. And the Republican senator from there is, no, dumbass, executing the drug dealers. What are you gonna do? Go execute the CEO of Purdue Pharma?
That's right. That isn't gonna solve the problem because the problem isn't some shady drug dealer standing on a dark street corner somewhere. It is, this system that we have set up with the pharmaceutical industry and its cozy ties to doctors. Some of these trips that they take these doctors on, how they persuade these doctors to overprescribe some of these incredibly addictive drugs. I mean, that is the heart of the problem. What is he gonna do? He's gonna execute the pharmaceutical CEOs? Of course he's not. So it's just a nonsense, armed tough on crime stance that isn't gonna materialize into anything beneficial. But I do wanna give you a quote from Trump and then give you the reality of how he's helped black market drug dealers in the past. So he said in regard to executing drug dealers recently, if you shoot one person, they give you life, meaning life in prison. They give you the death penalty. These people can kill 2,000, 3,000 people and nothing happens to them. Well, first of all, a lot of them do get caught and they do spend a lot of time behind bars. But what is the reality when it comes to Trump and drug dealers? Well, according to the Daily Beast, back in the 1980s, Trump helped a multi-kilo cocaine dealer escape with a minimal sentence. A little over a decade ago, Trump worked with a convicted pill pusher, this is another drug dealer, pill pusher to develop Trump Tower Philadelphia, a real estate deal that also involved Don Jr. and Ivanka. So I'll give you more details on who those drug dealers are. But when it came to one of these dealers, he literally wrote a letter to the judge in order to give this individual a minimal sentence and referred to this person as a good member of society, a credit to the community, conscientious, forthright, and diligent. Because it was one of his buddies. It was someone that he was doing deals with. So when it comes to that, no, doesn't care about being tough on crime.
And this is not, hey, a guy got caught with a couple of joints on the street and they say, oh, you were gonna deal it to your friends. No, he brought in tons of ecstasy from Belgium and then he did it over and over again and he brought in different kinds of drugs. He was a drug dealer.
Yes.
But he was rich and he had come from a rich family. So Trump's like, as long as you're rich, what do I care? And so they were gonna do Trump Tower together in Philadelphia. And he's like, well, he's a swell guy. Now, but if it's a poor drug dealer, let's execute the son of a bitch. Okay, the other guy from the 1980s that he also had to deal with, they used to use his helicopters.
That's
he
right.
also stayed in Trump Tower in New York, and they would use his helicopters to bring people to his Trump's Atlantic City casinos. So then he writes a glowing letter, and that guy's case got moved from Cincinnati for no reason to New Jersey, and guess who the judge was? Donald Trump's sister.
It was Donald, but then later she did recuse herself, to her credit, but.
No, only when they found out that she was also using the helicopters.
That's right.
Then she had to recuse herself. Then they handed it off to a friend of hers in that same court. And of course, the guy got a lenient sentence.
Yeah, served only 18 months and then was released to a halfway house.
In one of these cases, the drug dealer himself got, at the end of everything, finally 3 years after constantly violating the law. The people lower on the chain got 20 years. Why? Because they weren't rich. It's sick. It's absolutely sick. And as usual, the same thing with him when he uses illegal immigrants on his buildings, when he brings in more immigrants today, even when he's president, with visas, foreign workers, when he's railing against it, all of his products are made outside of the country. He had another case of hypocrisy. He says, execute the drug dealers, but not my buddies who are drug dealers who I love.
I mean, look, he bragged about lying to Justin Trudeau. What makes anyone think that he wouldn't lie to the American people just to get their votes?
Of course, and then finally, Senator Dan Sullivan, another right-wing Republican, this time from Alaska, when asked, you guys really gonna vote to execute drug dealers? He said, quote, I don't know if the president was serious or just said it off the cuff. In other words, even the Republican senators are like, look, the guy's a joker. You want me to take him seriously? But it turns out he is serious. It's in the actual proposal. So now they're gonna have to vote on whether to execute drug dealers. And if we have to bother telling you, we will. All the research shows that in other countries where they've tried execution as a way of stopping the demand for drugs and the amount of drugs that are in the country, it has never worked. You just watched a video by the Young Turks, the home of the revolution. If you'd like to get the full show, come join us and become a member. tytnetwork.com/join.